But what we're seeing, even before we had some of these products released, is that the IT industry overall has about an equivalent carbon footprint as the aviation sector. And forgetting numbers for a second, just if you make that mental comparison, I
Oh,
think
wow.
people have a general understanding that getting on a plane really does cost a lot to the planet. And we've seen a lot of people becoming much more conscious about that over the years. When you hear the jet engine firing up, like there's no denying you are using fossil fuels.
Yeah.
What we haven't yet seen in a more mainstream awareness sense is that the same thing is happening every time you're clicking a button and using one of these products. That somewhere around the world, a data center is lighting up, and since the energy supply in most of the world is still not on renewable energy, we're also costing the planet.
This is Inspiring Design, where unique innovators come together to share their knowledge, share their insight, and keep us up to date with the latest industry trends. And here's your host, Rashan Senanayake.
Welcome back to our most popular season yet, leading the way with some of the most critical conversation with regards to emerging technologies. Today is no different, and as the title suggests, a crucial message for us all, and an international conversation with two amazing speakers joining me to speak about the not so obvious relationship between AI and energy. So first up, I have here with me Yolande Strengers, a professor of digital technology and society at Monash University's Emerging Technologies Research Lab, where she leads the Energy Futures Research Program and her investigation on how digital technologies and AI are changing the lives of how we live. Her focus is on energy, sustainability, health, and equity outcomes using emerging technologies. Alongside her, I have here with me Melissa Gregg, an author, ethnographer, and consultant on sustainability strategies. She provides guidance on carbon emissions reduction and circular economy initiatives with a focus on employee and end user experience. Having worked for over 10 years at corporations such as Intel, she is on the cutting edge alongside the latest industry knowledge. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. All right, thank you both ladies who are joining us from different parts of the world, and welcome to Inspiring Design. As usual, can we start off with both of your backgrounds? What's your story and where do you hail from?
Great. So I'm Yolande Strengers, and I'm a digital sociologist in a faculty of information technology. So that gives you a hint already that I have my hands in many pies, and an interdisciplinary researcher. But primarily, I'm interested in how technologies are changing the ways in which we live and the impacts on that for various kind of societal concerns. One of which is energy consumption, which is the topic, of course, for today. And I've been working with the energy industry in Australia for well over a decade now on a number of challenges relating to different types of technologies, particularly those that are coming into people's homes. Things like smart home technologies. You might have heard of smart plugs or smart lights, or little contraptions that can control your air conditioner and align it with, when electricity is cheap or when the sun's shining. I've done sorts of work on solar panels and batteries and electric vehicles, and also just, I guess, bigger changes in our lifestyle as well that are affecting energy consumption, like emerging technologies for working from home or from entertaining ourselves or for caring for people. So it's quite a broad scope, and there's lots of changes coming in on the horizon, which all involve new technologies like AI and also have some pretty significant energy implications.
Absolutely, and I think it's great work that you're doing, and quite fun, I think. And most of us tend to don't sometimes see the ripple effects of these evolutionary things that we're going through, and quite fast paced as well. So brilliant! Can't wait to get into it. Melissa, what about yourself? What's your story?
Well, I'm also in the digital sociology and anthropology space, but I've done a couple of different paths than Yolande, I guess, because instead of staying in academia, where I first began as a researcher and worked in a couple of different universities in Australia, I took a big leap and moved into industry about 11 or 12 years ago, and moved to the US. And I've been working in the tech industry since then, firstly at Intel, through Intel Labs, and later the PC Group, where I led user experience research for many years. And in more recent times, and actually largely inspired by collaborating with Yolande in various ways over multiple projects, we have been doing some shared research on energy consumption and smart technologies in the domestic space. And that focus on energy and sustainability has been something I've wanted to get into more. And towards the end of my time at Intel, I set up one of the first teams really focused on energy consumption and the relationship to corporate sustainability goals for the company. And so one of the things I do now as a consultant is work with other tech companies on how to get engineers and technologists to get more involved in designing products that have more sustainable principles behind them, and making a link between the sorts of product design decisions that are being made and some of those bigger ambitions that the companies have on reducing their carbon footprint overall, and creating important targets towards reducing the overall environmental impact of the industry. So as an ethnographer and anthropologist and sociologist, a lot of what I'm trying to do is understand how culture, particularly the culture of companies, can get in the way of getting some of those goals delivered, but also the human behavior side of it, how the use of products contributes to those overall metrics that people are trying to count and ultimately address.
Yeah, wow. Honestly, very valuable work. And I think these two worlds are, when we, I think, went through schooling myself, we tend to sometimes think sustainability in a different world and then technology in a different world, but they're both obviously colliding and they're holding hands now. So let's get straight into it. Obviously, there's been some things in social media, very, very brief things on the news as well recently, that people are starting to notice this huge requirements in energy after the AI tools that we use almost every day now has gone mainstream. Now, schools use it, universities use it, industry uses it, and it's growing so rapidly. What is, at a high level, can you explain what's the relationship between the energy sector and consumer level AI?
I'll take a first pass at that. It's a very complex set of questions, because one thing Yolande and I have both written about and have written about together recently is the fact that these two sectors are actually converging. So on the one hand, I think those of us who've come to technology through using mobile phones and computers over the years have probably not had to think that much about how the apps we're using or the software packages or the tools that we do our jobs with are contributing to energy demand. It's just not really something that you've had to worry about. And in fact, if there has been an engineering conversation about it, it tends to be in this language that's also driven by the industry, that engineers are optimizing technology to be more energy efficient. So if that's the cadence of Moore's law, that you make things run faster for cheaper, and that this is actually one of the things that's been quite predictable about the industry over many years. But since the introduction of these different ways of using technology that rely on large streams of data to be both collected and processed in the course of your use of it, and developers making it, that has created an unusually high amount of demand on the energy grid, just because it takes so much capacity out of the server farms, the data centers that hold that data. And so often there's a lot of transmission cost too, from you putting in a request to do something using an AI tool, and that request actually hitting somewhere physically in a data center where the data is either going or being retrieved. So once you add up all of those costs, and once you think about the number of products that have been released lately that are claiming to have AI embedded in them, things that we may or may not actually require to have AI in them, and we can talk about that too. There's just been an infinite explosion of potential energy use that now a lot of the companies that are producing these products are perversely responsible for servicing. So that's just a sneak peek of some of the work that I'm doing at the moment in the industry, where even though the tech companies themselves have claimed that they're moving towards carbon neutral goals, zero emissions and renewable energy, the fact that they're putting out products that create this intense power draw really puts them in a difficult position to be able to do both things at once.
One of the main, like, I think what you said was brilliant, and a lot of people tend to generally, they overlook that. And even at a designer or a developer level, you know, the ripple effects of the consequences of adding AI, it's almost becoming like a bit of a mandatory thing that if AI is not in your tool or the software, it's almost now seen as a little bit outdated sometimes, or not at that cutting edge level. So what do you think they should be doing in terms of, I don't know, balancing those two edges of meeting a demand as well as what they should be doing, and whether or not, how do they make a decision on whether AI should be part of things that they're designing or not?
If we're talking about some of the big tech companies, I think it's hard to go back now, isn't it? Because the point of competition seems to be on the quality of these large AI capabilities. And once you've decided that that's what you're going to compete on, you know, from a business point of view, that's hard to reverse. So I think we're in a really interesting moment, because what we're starting to see in corporations is a bit of tension, right, between the business as usual plan, which, if we're following the same cadence of releasing new products every couple of years that have percentage improvements, we're now seeing what's often being described as a step change in the capacity of the products, but also the infrastructure that's going to be required to support it. So I don't know what they're going to do. I think all we can really do as consultants and as scholars and researchers and advisors is to say, these are the consequences, and are you sure that that's really a sustainable direction? What we've seen in the last 6 months or so, as more of these companies have released to shareholders and to their boards the annual reporting that goes into disclosing carbon emissions, there's an obvious problem. And we're putting a lot of investment and hope in the idea that technology is going to solve that problem on energy supply. But at the moment, it's not really clear where those technologies are coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also exciting because it also does present this opportunity for us to be able to almost redo things in a different way. So I think it's a good thing, but I feel like the level of capability and the things we have to consider almost on the fly has increased or exponentially, and I think that's where I think the developers and the designers struggle quite a bit. You mentioned there's some statistics that you can share. What are some numbers that listeners always love to hear from those kinds of perspectives? Are there any stats that you can share?
Well, look, I'll just be very general in this, because one of the problems with talking about energy consumption in tech companies is that they're not public knowledge. The data are not typically released, and a lot of the work that I do now is helping different companies get involved in discussing standards that the industry needs to form to create transparency on both the supply chain for the infrastructure for energy use, and also the hardware that goes into some of those data centers. But what we're seeing, even before we had some of these products released, is that the IT industry overall has about an equivalent carbon footprint as the aviation sector. And forgetting numbers for a second, just if you make that mental comparison, I think people have a general understanding that getting on a plane really does cost a lot to the planet. And we've seen a lot of people becoming much more conscious about that over the years. When you hear the jet engine firing up, like there's no denying you are using fossil fuels.
Yeah.
What we haven't yet seen in a more mainstream awareness sense is that the same thing is happening every time you're clicking a button and using one of these products. That somewhere around the world, a data center is lighting up. And since the energy supply in most of the world is still not on renewable energy, we're also costing the planet. So that's really the main message, regardless of whether we have the accurate statistics on particular companies' energy use, and there are other resource questions we could consider too. That's the take-home message, is just that there are consequences to using these tools.
Yeah, perfect. Yolande, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, look, I can just add a little bit to what Melissa's been saying. I mean, we generally, when we think about the energy from any kind of technology that we're using, we focus on the direct consumption, the stuff that we pay for and can see. So that's usually what we see in our electricity bills, or what comes through, every 3 months or so in terms of our consumption. And sometimes if you've got an energy app, you might see the direct kind of impact of what you're using. Now, when you look at the energy consumption from AI tools, it's often quite minimal, it's quite small. So it's not really obvious that it's using a lot of direct consumption to begin with. Where it does add up, though, is the proliferation of digital devices. So we've seen quite a significant increase in energy, not from any single device, but from many technologies entering the home. And that's not just AI, it's sort of broader digital technologies as well. And also the broader electrification of the home in many states in Australia, that shift away from gas to electricity. Now, there's two other areas where we don't see the energy consumption that still is, well, quite significant, and as Mel's saying, more significant. The first is the embedded energy, which is the energy that actually goes into the production of the devices. So that's, all of the materials, the manufacturing, the transportation of raw materials, the transportation of the device itself, often from, far places in the world to distribution centres to our homes. So that's a very significant energy cost. And then the other area which Mel's been talking about is, of course, the impact of the data centres and the data streaming services that also have, or probably the most significant energy costs, but the most invisible one as well. That's the one that we tend to not think about. And it's not just energy, I should add, it's also water. So there's other resources involved here as well.
Yeah.
I know we're focusing on energy today, but there's significant impacts, not just in terms of energy consumption, but also on mineral extraction, on water consumption, on waste. This is a kind of very holistic sustainability issue that touches on all of those domains.
Absolutely. And I think I feel like there's a massive education piece here where this information almost needs to be given to the consumer level as well, because if every person makes a little bit of an adjustment, or they're aware of what that looks like when they're using those tools, the ripple effects of it, alongside this other side of what industry is doing, I feel like it needs to go hand in hand. And onto thinking about my next question, I feel like it's a very tough ask, simply because the evolution of AI tools and the usage of it in the last 2 years alone has been incredible and almost unprecedented. We don't really have something to compare, I feel like. But what do you think, in the current trajectory that we're going in, what would our world look like in 2035, 2040, looking at that maybe about another 10 to 15 years from now? Is that even something that you can map?
Look, I can start with this one and then I'll pass over to Melissa. We have been doing quite a lot of work on this in our research lab, the Emerging Technologies Research Lab, through a number of projects focused on the future of energy consumption in Australia, looking out to 2030 and 2050 horizons. And AI has been a really big part of that. And we've been producing some different scenarios for thinking about the future. We've also been doing this work with schools, funnily enough. We've been running some research alongside the Monash Tech School, which delivers outreach programs for schools in Victoria and designs new curriculum, in this case around energy futures and AI futures with school students. So we've been asking students to think about what the 2050s might look like as well. But look, there's lots of different possibilities, and there's no kind of one path that I think is clear yet, at least from my perspective. So certainly we're seeing a proliferation of AI and an embedding of it across all aspects of our lives, and that's likely to continue. But I think there's some critical decisions that governments and in industry are making that could sort of determine some of the outcomes around what that means for how we operate and live. So it could mean, for instance, that we're all very individual focused. We have our own, all have our own devices like we do now, but we're very dependent on ourselves. If, for instance, there is some kind of climate risk or a big storm or a heat wave or what have you, that we sort of bunker down into our homes and rely on technologies if they're operating to get us through those tough times.
Yeah.
But we also are seeing sort of moves from governments to use AI to orchestrate the coordinate energy demand, because we obviously, energy demand is something that fluctuates throughout the day in terms of production and also in terms of when we want to use it. And that will become even more so in the future, particularly with renewable sources and also with more extreme weather, because that really creates spikes in when energy is needed.
Yeah.
So there's a push from the energy industry to use AI to manage some of that, to coordinate when we're charging our batteries, when we're charging our electric vehicles, when we're using, our air conditioning, and trying to kind of get some control over balancing that supply and demand using AI technology. So that's a kind of another scenario that is on the horizon. It's not without its issues, because a lot of people that we've spoken to actually want to be able to override automation and AI tools whenever they feel the need to. So that could create new problems in the energy system. But yeah, look, there's lots. That's a couple of possibilities. I don't want to overwhelm your listeners. But
no, look, I think this is brilliant, because I think hearing about these things is when you start to actually understand, we're actually going in a really horrible direction, and obviously that starts to filter in, but there's possible pathways that we can do, right? So I think raising awareness is a very, very good thing, but I think it's great. Great to hear about it.
It's not all horrible. There are ways forward, I think, and
correct.
AI can be part of also an orchestration that's more societal led, that's more I guess not kind of just kind of leaving everybody to themselves and to the individual market to manage some of these risks that are coming, particularly with climate change. Because I think anytime you're talking about the future, we have to factor in those changes in climate that Bureau of Meteorology and others are pretty clear about now. So there are ways forward, but if we sort of continue with everybody just fending for themselves, that probably won't deliver the best outcomes.
I think that's well said. What are your thoughts, Mel?
Yeah, well, not to continue the negative theme too much, but so one of the things that's really clear to me from where I sit at the moment is that we have a bit of a new colonial system being introduced. And what I mean by that is, are you comfortable with Google for example, Google navigating and negotiating the energy supply for your town? Or, is it going to be okay if Microsoft moves a substantial amount of its company infrastructure to a country where the energy supply is renewable, but that comes at the cost of great farmland for the local community? So one of the things that I worry about, given who's in charge and who's at the table right now on how the infrastructure for IT energy is being built, is that these are very private conversations, right? These are not accountable to the sorts of policy and regulation that Yolande is optimistic for. And they're certainly not easily accessible to citizens. So what I wonder is, are we aware when we're participating in purchasing these products that the next effect of that is that there needs to be a foundation supplying the ongoing infrastructure? And that is coming at the expense of those who may not have actually benefited from the first wave of computing, from the first wave of productivity, which is the way that a lot of AI technology is being justified. who's being more productive with these technologies and whose livelihoods are actually being left out of the conversation entirely, because we don't all want to be knowledge workers sitting in front of computers all day. And in front of a computer at the moment, it seems like the only sort of way out of that in the imaginary of tech companies at the moment is, oh, we'll give you something that's smaller to compute on, a watch or a pair of glasses. But it's still the same idea that the early adopters of the technology are now in very powerful positions to negotiate where the infrastructure lands in order to keep the appetite serviced for a particular mode of computing. And so where I hope we're going to have a lot more activity in the short term is in both developer activity and also citizen-led activity demanding low-carbon alternatives to the sorts of AI-driven futures we're being given at the moment, because it is a new form of elitism that's being supported by a very small handful of companies that have the power to negotiate power. And that to me is very worrying. And we all do need to figure out a way to get more involved, since so many of us depend on these technologies now for our livelihoods.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where a lot of these conversations and what would be the ideal scenario in your viewpoint of what that would look like? Is it supposed to be a democratic vote? Or because if it wasn't for these, some may argue that if these types of product innovations weren't being done from a private capacity, we wouldn't be having these types of evolutionary changes and innovations as a part of it. So what's an ideal world look like?
Well, to your general interest here on this podcast, I think it's about ensuring that education is available to people to understand, like the backbone for what these technologies looks like and what's involved at a very local level, as much as this more planetary or global level that I mentioned by pulling out the colonial term. Because I think one thing, as someone who worked in the field of user experience for many years in the tech industry, we're very good at making products that reduced friction for users to adopt them. One of the things that's happening with AI at the moment is that there's an incredible amount of learning that has to go on, and that burden of learning is really being pushed onto the user. It seems as though it's sort of up to us to keep up with the technology and learning the language of the technology instead of it coming to us. And so what I think needs to happen in those spaces as we're learning the new language is also to learn the language of responsibility and civics that should come with those technologies, so that we are aware and that we can have new rights, responsibilities and obligations as we get those technologies through the various channels of distribution. And I mentioned that there are efforts underway to create standards and transparency in the industry on energy use at the moment. But the voices in those rooms are industry representatives. There are very few, particularly in the United States where I have been located, very few civic groups or non-partisan participants. So one thing you'll hear very regularly here in the US is we'll wait for regulation coming from Europe, because that is actually where you see a lot more participation from those non-partisan groups and very informed and educated advocacy organizations, right, that have the technical literacy to speak on behalf of citizens. And I think that's what we need to see a lot more places.
Fair enough. Yeah, Yolande, what are your thoughts?
Well, agree with everything Melissa's saying there, as well as I think, and Melissa did touch on this, just the lack of inspiration really for alternative visions and imaginaries about what this could actually look like. So, part of the problem is because we are working with a very narrow group of technology companies that are quite elite, it's hard for other voices and other visions to get a foot in. And in fact, it's hard to even imagine anything different from what we have now and what we're being promised and what we're being sold. So it's going to take quite an active effort, including in schools, to actually think about this in a different way. And that was actually really the basis of the program that we started with Monash Tech School, was to get school students to think creatively and innovatively about what they think the future school might look like with new forms of AI and energy, because young people's voices are completely missing from this conversation.
True.
And also even from much research that's being done on what will the future look like. And often I find young people have really creative, out of the box thinking. Sometimes it seems a little bit strange, but when you sort of understand their logic, and often there's something there that's actually really exciting and interesting. And we so desperately need different ways of thinking about the future and different ways in which technology might be part of our lives. So we need all these different voices and at the table. So, I guess another thing to say to people is to, just encourage everybody to participate in those opportunities, to seek out, alternative ways of thinking, and not just sort of accept the visions that are coming from the tech industry and the marketing and, all the things that we're flooded with about, how AI is going to change our lives. Because a lot of it is not, I don't think, very realistic, and a lot of it's not also very desirable.
There you go. I think it's allowed both your different perspectives that you're coming from. And my next question is wanting to explore some potential strategies as potentially from an everyday person's perspective. But I feel like we've kind of also addressed potential strategies that industry developers, those types of thought processes should be doing, as well as consumers on an everyday basis. But let's take it one at a time. What are your thoughts on potential strategies that an everyday person could start to employ in 2024 when they're wanting the urge to go to Copilot or GPT or whatever the tool that they're thinking of using, just because it's an everyday, it's almost like as familiar as Microsoft Word now, like it's, especially in a school, university environment, younger students tend to think of that as the normality, right? So if they're listening in, if there's teachers listening in, what are your thoughts on some advice or strategies that they could do to work towards a more desirable future? Tough question.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what I've been trying to think about is, again, what's the right mental model, as we say in the design world. And for a lot of people, I think this comes down to whether this is a tool or a toy. And when you think about the amount of resource use that we've been talking about so far, if we think that something is easy to use, it doesn't necessarily mean that every occasion is the right occasion to use it. And I think part of what we have to understand is that going back to those questions of who's the product being designed for today, if we use it, who will not have the chance to use it in future? Because there are literally not going to be enough planetary resources for us to keep using things in quite the same way. So my very outdated, nerdy way of looking at this is just to say, in the old classic sustainability language, we need to reduce the number of times that we use these products. We need to reuse the hardware that these products are sold to us on, and that can also include sharing the hardware that we don't any longer use because it is outdated, to have people making the most of those embodied carbon and inherited devices that are already out in the world, with a whole lot of production gone into them to make sure that everybody can have access to computing, because we still don't have that. And then third of all, again, on the end of life of these products, if it's no longer useful for us because it doesn't run Copilot, think of all the other people that could use either the system itself or the resources and materials that are inside that system. I think one thing I've noticed working in large companies and the business side of that equation is we don't do a good job of understanding where the technology assets go. Mm-hmm. And so in our embrace of these new technologies, I think the very least we can do is make sure that we have passed on or given closure to the technologies we no longer want to use. Because again, if we're thinking about how sustainable this industry is overall, we have this real debt already on the topic of e-waste and the ways in which we haven't got into the best habits of moving on from previous devices. So that's what I would encourage people to understand and talk about. It's like, how many computers will you need in your lifetime? And what have happened to all the ones that you've had before? And that can be hard to remember to do when we're in the mode of convenience and it being very easy to use. That has been one of the challenges that the field of user experience hasn't always grappled with. Absolutely.
And actually, a recent conversation with a friend of mine, we were actually talking about something similar in terms of what's the average, lifespan that we would use for a given laptop or a PC that we prior to the AI era. And I'm still sitting personally in roughly that 6 to 8 years of a device use. And people are just surprised by that because it's almost like, quote unquote, not cool anymore to be that old.
It's very cool to me.
Well, that's the thing. I think it's a completely different way of looking at it, and we're almost geared towards these yearly upgrades just because of the latest features and the latest next iteration and so forth. So I think that you raise a valuable advice piece there, and listeners should be able to take a note of that, definitely. Yolande, what are your thoughts? What are some potential strategies that we can do as everyday people?
Yeah, look, I think it's often quite daunting thinking about this as an individual consumer because it feels like there's not a lot of choice, that, there's not a lot of affordability for things that are sustainable, and that it's often quite difficult to do some of the things that Mel's talking about, like to recycle or to dispose of things ethically. Tips haven't always worked out ways in which we can responsibly dispose of different technologies, and they're often quite slow to catch up. So I just wanted to acknowledge that this isn't an easy thing for individual consumers to respond to. And so, while I think all of those things are really important, the other aspect of this is, of course, putting pressure on technology companies and on governments to enact changes that are beyond the individual consumer. And Mel sort of mentioned some of those earlier on in terms of, citizen groups and things that you can get involved in. But I do think that this is something that needs to be, pushed further up, that we need changes within technology companies and within government policy that then make all of these things much easier for individual consumers. But also, of course, there is a piece there in terms of us being aware of these issues and where there are opportunities to buy things that are better, have sort of better outcomes for the environment, or dispose of things more ethically, that we do take those up. But yeah, it's very much there's limits, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, to what everyday people can do in this current environment.
Yeah. I think that's also a valuable piece of advice. It is both ends of that. I think spectrum needs to be doing their part for sure. So good to hear two different viewpoints, almost opposing but holding hands. And going back to that analogy, those two different worlds are starting to, and almost we have to make sure that they do work hand in hand. So thank you both. And one of the things I think does spin, and I look at it as a bit of a silver lining, is when these evolutionary changes happen, these fast-paced changes do things and problems are created, we have opportunities for new career pathways, new skills, new problem-solving techniques, new needs. Now, I'm always a believer on design-led thinking and anything to do with creative problem-solving. Whatever the context, I feel like that is a human skill that applies to every single career pathway. When you're looking at the conversation between AI and energy, what are some useful career pathways that are kind of starting to emerge as a result of these things?
Yeah, well, look, I think that for me, the promising area that I've been exploring through Faculty of IT is the combination of the social and the technical sciences, because what I see here is not just a technical challenge, and I'm sure Melissa would agree with this as well, but this is a massive societal challenge because it's about how we live and our expectations for lifestyles involving technologies, what it is that we actually want from technology. And that's inherently a social question.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the way that the careers are sort of heading or need to head is this combination of the humanities or the social sciences together with the technical sciences. They have been historically quite separated. And that's actually created a whole lot of problems, things like ethics and biases and just bad outcomes that weren't really anticipated properly, or all because we've had a largely sort of engineering-led or very technical-led sort of teams developing products without fully appreciating and understanding the consequences of those. So we need to move towards an education system where these two streams, the STEM or the HAS, whatever you want to call them, the social and technical, are far more aligned. We're actually seeing that at Monash University. We've had massive growth in our double degrees, particularly between arts and IT. And that's also one of our highest employability degrees coming out of the university, which is, I think, speaks for itself in terms of what the industry is actually wanting as well. So this is being driven also now by industry in terms of the skill sets that they're looking for from graduates. They want all-rounded academics. And in fact, the degrees, just the IT degrees themselves and computing science degrees, are also shifting and becoming much more cognizant of these issues and embedding, more social content, more ethical content into the degrees themselves, just as single degree pathways. So that's where I think things are going. And in terms of the school sector, it's probably a little bit behind in this area. We have great subjects around history. We don't have a curriculum around futures yet, but I think that's a promising opportunity as well. And certainly thinking about this industry trend or this need to develop career pathways that combine the social and technical is something that schools could be thinking about as well.
Brilliant. Mel, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm just reminded, I've just finished attending virtually a conference of business anthropologists here in the US, which reminded me just how many different forms of humanities and social science training are becoming relevant in new ways with the outlay of some of these AI technologies. One of the companies I work with right now is Meta Reality Labs, who, are hiring everyone from psychologists to talk about the cognitive load that we can bear by wearing smart sunglasses to optical scientists to actually build the different films and glass that we'll need to be able to carry the sorts of projections that these prototypes are currently exploring. But at the same time, the same company, because these companies are so big, is also needing a lot more expertise in, the nuances of geography when the data that's being processed by those hardware products is going back to a server farm. And we're thinking about what kinds of, as I said earlier, lifestyles and livelihoods are being put to one side in the consideration of this ever-expanding growth for AI needs. And one of the things I guess I find really reassuring, and I always like to tell people, is that the humanities and social sciences offer so many different flexible skills, but particularly skills in understanding people and the ways that human behavior is different in different parts of the world. And what we sometimes forget when thinking about AI technologies is that if there is this hub of innovation that's often the West Coast of the United States when it comes to these technology companies, they are also full of international employees who've come from all over the world. But at the same time, they're all like driving on the same freeways and eating the same food as people in the United States. And so that can cloud your vision sometimes. And I think it's always been the case that I've found it really valuable to mobilize that perspective of being from somewhere else to make sure that the decisions that are being made on products and business direction are actually realistic for the user base for technologies, which is, it's worldwide. So this is sort of for me to say, it's really surprising how some of the classic disciplines that students may be studying, from philosophy to psychology to the deep sciences, can have applications in these new fields. But also, I think some of those classic forms of scholarship around ethics and philosophy, and even religion, in the sense that we need to make sure that all cultures are represented in the way that devices are being assumed to be useful. They're all things that I would encourage people to continue to study, because they still have relevance.
Love that. And I think because you just touched on a very good point of these classic pathways that we almost have been very used to, they're just becoming transferable, and they're just finding its new place in this new tech era, but they're not outdated. They're just finding that next iteration of what that looks like from a different perspective. So I'm always a believer of that as well, because personally speaking, I went through architecture to go on into education, but the design thinking component being used to solve problems in the education sector, it's the same application, the way I see it, but done with the technology components there as well. So love both your advice, and I think that's been really brilliant. One of the last things I want to ask is, I feel like we can talk about this topic for hours and hours, but just being aware of time, what's your advice for educators? Because they have a tough job. Let's look at it from a high school level first, or the schooling sector first, and then tertiary, because they're grappling with having to keep up with the technology. They're grappling with everyday demands of a teacher shortages, work intensification, all of these things. What's your advice for them in terms of building the future generations, and maybe something little or big that they could do to embed these good practice behaviors and or even raise awareness?
I've got a small one, like the really small one. Turn your devices off when you're not using them.
Love it.
And try and get people into the habit of realizing that they don't need to be always on. One of the things I just saw at a different conference recently was the amount of energy you can save by having links on a website go to sleep when they're not being used very often. And there's just all of these ways that I think we assume that technology has to be ready and waiting for us as soon as we sort of walk up to it, or as soon as thought enters our mind that we need to Google something. But if we erase all of the time for reflection and rest and sleep, we're probably not going to be at our best. And I think if we're raising students and young people to enter this world where technology is so-called ubiquitous, there's an ongoing dream that there will be technology everywhere, we need to carve out space for rest and recovery and reflection. But the benefit of turning your devices off is that you save power. And I think that's the very least we could do at the end of the day, to just try and remind ourselves that everybody deserves the rest. Our devices too.
Yeah, well said. Yolande, what are your thoughts?
Well, I guess taking a slightly different approach to that question, Rashan, there was a fantastic report that came out, I think a year or two ago now, called 100 Jobs of the Future. And it just is a really great sort of source of inspiration, I think, for anyone working in the education sector about what's coming. And it sort of helps. I think it could actually be used in the classroom as well to kind of get students thinking about what career pathways might be open to them, because we have sort of got a little bit stuck, I think, on the idea of traditional careers and fairly, solo disciplinary paths. But if you have a look at this report, there's all sorts of new jobs coming that are anticipated in this report that are super interesting. And they do reframe education quite a lot in terms of what skills will be needed. And a lot of them also are kind of combining those social and technical skills that we spoke about earlier. So I realise teachers are super busy, but perhaps that's an easy resource they could go to either for themselves or to put in front of students to start to think a bit differently about what kind of education is needed and what skills are needed for the future.
Perfect. We'll make sure to link that in the show notes as well. And that was going to be one of my next thoughts, which was a potential resource that people could use to learn from. So you've kind of answered that already. So thank you both so much. I feel like the work that you're doing is honestly one of the most valuable things, because questioning these things, challenges these I think nuances and having these types of discussions is brilliant. So really appreciate both of you for giving up your time despite your busy schedules. We made it just work. And if listeners do want to reach out to both of you, what's the best method to get in touch?
Well, we've got lots of resources on our webpage, Rashan, so that's probably a good place to start. And I'll link them in the chat as well. I'm actually about to go on some leave, so I won't be around for a little while, so I'm hesitant to pass on contact details. But yeah, that's probably a good place to start and to get familiar with some of our work.
Perfect.
Yeah, and LinkedIn is another place, since I work a lot with the corporate sector, that's where people tend to congregate. And we have a couple of papers, Yolande and I have written, that we could also share in the notes, just so that people can get a flavour of what social science and ethnography looks like in practice around these issues, because we would love to inspire a next generation of anthropologists and sociologists tackling these questions.
Perfect. Well, look, thank you so much. Keep inspiring, and I'm actually looking forward to reading that paper myself. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for today's episode. Now it's time to take action and build on the learnings to get inspired. First up, jump onto rashansenanayake.com/podcast and check out the show notes, links, and other relevant learning materials from this amazing episode. Next, if you learned something new today, click that subscribe button and set yourself up to receive live notifications on future episodes, as well as more opportunities to learn from our amazing guests, brands, and speakers. Last but not least, it's time to have your say. Join the conversation and share your thoughts and feedback on today's episode with a review, all while joining many others with a 5-star rating for Inspiring Design with Rashan Senanayake. Till next time.